Story 20 of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vince D. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Story 20, The Old Fellow's Letter. Ruggles and I were down on the old fellow. It doesn't matter why, and since in a story of this kind we must tell the truth no matter what happens, or else where is the use of writing a story at all? I'll have to confess that we had deserved all we got, and that the old fellow did no more than his duty by us. Both Ruggles and I see that now, since we have had time to cool off. But at the moment we were in a fearful wax at the old fellow, and were bound to hatch up something to get even with him. Of course, the old fellow had another name, just as Ruggles has another name. He is principal of the Frampton Academy, the old fellow, not Ruggles, and his name is George Osborne. We have to call him Mr. Osborne to his face, but he is the old fellow everywhere else. He is quite old, 36 if he's a day, and whatever possessed Sylvia Grant. But there, I'm getting ahead of my story. Most of the cads like the old fellow. Even Ruggles and I like him on the average. The girls are always a little provoked at him because he is so shy and absent-minded, but when it comes to the point, they like him too. I heard Emma White say once that he was so handsome. I nearly whooped. Ruggles was mad because he's gone on M. For the idea of calling a thin, pale, dark, dreamy-looking chap like the old fellow handsome was more than I could stand without guffawing. M probably said it to provoke Ruggles. She couldn't really have thought it. Mickey, the English professor, now, if she had called him handsome, there would have been some sense to it. He is splendid, big 6-footer with magnificent muscles, red cheeks, and curly yellow hair. I can't see how he can be contented to sit down and teach mushy English literature and poetry and that sort of thing. It would have been more in keeping with the old fellow. There was a rumor running at large in the academy that the old fellow wrote poetry, but he ran the mathematics and didn't make such a foozle of it as you might suppose either. Ruggles and I meant to get square with the old fellow if it took all term. At least we said so. But if Providence hadn't sent Sylvia Grant walking down the street past our boarding house that afternoon, we should probably have cooled off before we thought of any working plan of revenge. Sylvia Grant did go down the street, however. Ruggles, hanging halfway out of the window as usual, saw her and called me to go and look. Of course, I went. Sylvia Grant was always worth looking at. There was no girl in Frampton who could hold a candle to her when it came to beauty. As for brains, that is another thing altogether. My private opinion is that Sylvia hadn't any, or she would never have preferred... But there, I'm getting on too fast again. Ruggles should have written this story. He can concentrate better. Sylvia was the Latin professor's daughter. She wasn't a cad girl, of course. She was over 20 and had graduated from it 2 years ago. But she was in all the social things that went on in the academy, and all the unmarried professors, except the old fellow, were in love with her. Mickey had it the worst, and we had all made up our minds that Sylvia would marry Mickey. He was so handsome we didn't see how she could help it. I tell you, they made a dandy-looking couple when they were together. Well, as I said before, I toddled to the window to have a look at the fair Sylvia. She was all togged out in some new fall duds, and I guess she'd come out to show them off. They were brownish kind of, and she'd a spanking hat on with feathers and things in it. Her hair was shining under it, all purply black, and she looked sweet enough to eat. Then she saw Ruggles and me, and she waved her hand and laughed, and her big blackish blue eyes sparkled. But she hadn't been laughing before, or sparkling either. I'd thought she looked kind of glum, and I wondered if she and Mickey had had a falling out. I rather suspected it, for at the senior prom, 3 nights before, she had hardly looked at Mickey, but had sat in a corner and talked to the old fellow. He didn't do much talking. He was too shy, and he looked mighty uncomfortable. I thought it kind of mean of Sylvia to torment him so, when she knew he hated to have to talk to girls. But when I saw Mickey scowling at the corner, I knew she was doing it to make him jealous. Girls won't stick at anything when they want to provoke a chap. I know it to my cost, for Jenny Price. Oh, but that has nothing to do with this story. Just across the square, Sylvia met the old fellow and bowed. He lifted his hat and passed on, But after a few steps, he turned and looked back. He caught Sylvia doing the same thing, so he wheeled and came on, looking mighty foolish. As he passed beneath our window, Ruggles chuckled fiendishly. "I've thought of something, Paulie," he said. My name is Paul. "Bet you it will make the old fellow squirm. Let's write a letter to Sylvia Grant, a love letter, and sign the old fellow's name to it. She'll give him a fearful snubbing, and we'll be revenged." "But who'll write it?" I said doubtfully. "I can't. You'll have to, Ruggles. You've had more practice." Ruggles turned red. I know he writes to M. White in vacations. "I'll do my best," he said quite meekly. "That is, I'll compose it, but you'll have to copy it. You can imitate the old fellow's handwriting so well." "But look here," I said, an uncomfortable idea striking me. "What about Sylvia? Won't she feel kind of flattish when she finds out he didn't write it? For of course he'll tell her. We haven't anything against her, you know." "Oh, Sylvia won't care," said Ruggles serenely. "She's the sort of girl who can take a joke. I've seen her eyes shine over tricks we've played on the professors before now. She'll just laugh. Besides, she doesn't like the old fellow a bit. I know from the way she acts with him. She's always so cool and stiff when he's about. Not a bit like she is with the other professors." Well, Ruggles wrote the letter. At first he tried to pass it off on me as his own composition, but I know a few little things, and one of them is that Ruggles couldn't have made up that letter any more than he could have written a sonnet. I told him so, and made him own up. He had a copy of an old letter that had been written to his sister by her young man. I suppose Ruggles had stolen it, but there is no inquiry too close into these things. Anyhow, that letter just filled the bill. It was beautifully expressed. Ruggles' sister's young man must have possessed lots of ability. He was an English professor, something like Mickey, so I suppose he was extra good at it. He started in by telling her how much he loved her and what an angel of beauty and goodness he had always thought her, how unworthy he felt himself of her, and how little hope he had that she could ever care for him. And he wound up by imploring her to tell him if she could possibly love him a little bit and all that sort of thing. I copied the letter out on heliotrope paper, in my best imitation of the old fellow's handwriting, and signed it. "Yours devotedly and imploringly, George Osborne." Then we mailed it that very evening. The next evening, the Cad girls gave a big reception in the assembly hall to the Academy alumna who was visiting the Greek professor's wife. It was the smartest event of the term, and everybody was there, students and faculty, and, of course, Sylvia Grant. Sylvia looked stunning. She was all in white, with a string of pearls about her pretty round throat and a couple of little pink roses in her black hair. I never saw her so smiling and bright, but she seemed quieter than usual, and avoided poor Mickey so skillfully that it was really a pleasure to watch her. The old fellow came in late, with his tie all crooked as it always was. I saw Sylvia blush and nudged Ruggles to look. "She's thinking of the letter," he said. Ruggles and I never meant to listen. Upon my word, we didn't. It was pure accident. We were in behind the flags and palms in the modern languages room, fixing up a plan how to get Em and Jenny off for a moonlit stroll in the grounds. These things require diplomacy, I can tell you, for there are always so many other fellows hanging about. When in came Sylvia Grant and the old fellow arm in arm. The room was quite empty, or they thought it was, and they sat down just on the other side of the flags. They couldn't see us, but we could see them quite plainly. Sylvia still looked smiling and happy, not a bit mad as we had expected, for just kind of shy and radiant. As for the old fellow, he looked, as M. White would say, as sphinx-like as ever. I'd defy any man alive to tell from the old fellow's expression what he was thinking about, or what he felt like at any time. Then all at once, Sylvia said softly with her eyes cast down, "I received your letter, Mr. Osborne." Any other man in the world would have jumped, or said, "My letter?" or shown surprise in some way. But the old fellow was a nerve. He looked sideways at Sylvia for a moment, and then he said kind of dryly, "Ah, did you?" "Yes," said Sylvia, not much above a whisper. It surprised me very much. I never supposed that you cared for me in that way." "Could you tell me how I could help caring?" said the old fellow, in the strangest way. His voice actually trembled. I I don't think I would tell you if I knew, said Sylvia, turning her head away. You see, I don't want you to help caring. Sylvia! You never saw such a transformation as came over the old fellow. His eyes just blazed, but his face went white. He bent forward and took her hand. Sylvia, do you mean that you actually care a little for me, dearest? Oh, Sylvia, do you mean that? Of course I do, said Sylvia right out. I've always cared, ever since I was a little girl coming here to school and breaking my heart over mathematics, although I hated them, just to be in your class. Why, I've treasured up old geometry exercises you wrote out for me just because you wrote them, but I thought I could never make you care for me. I was the happiest girl in the world when your letter came today. Sylvia, said the old fellow, I've loved you for years, but I never dreamed that you could care for me. I thought it quite useless to tell you of my love before. Can you be my wife, darling? At this point, Ruggles and I differ as to what came next. He asserts that Sylvia turned square round and kissed the old fellow, but I'm sure she just turned her face and gave him a look, and then he kissed her. Anyhow, there they both were, going on at the silliest rate about how much they loved each other and how the old fellow thought she loved Mickey and all that sort of thing. It was awful. I never thought the old fellow or Sylvia either could be so spoony. Ruggles and I would have given anything on earth to be out of that. We knew we'd no business to be there, and we felt as foolish as flatfish. It was a tremendous relief when the old fellow and Sylvia got up at last and trailed away, both of them looking idiotically happy. Well, did you ever? Said Ruggles. It was a girl's exclamation, but nothing else would have expressed his feelings. No, I never, I said. To think that Sylvia Grant should be sweet on the old fellow when she could have Mickey. It passes comprehension. Did she really promise to marry him, Ruggles? She did, said Ruggles gloomily. But I say, isn't that old fellow game? Tumbled to the trick in a jiff. Never let on but what he wrote the letter. Never will let on, I bet. Where does the joke come in, Polly, my boy? It's on us, I said, but nobody will know of it if we hold our tongues. We'll have to hold them anyhow for Sylvia's sake, since she's been goose enough to go and fall in love with the old fellow. She'd go wild if she ever found out the letter was a hoax. We have made that match, Ruggles. He'd never have got up enough spunk to tell her he wanted her, and she'd probably have married Mickey out of spite. Well, you know, the old fellow isn't a bad sort after all, said Ruggles. And he's really awfully gone on her, so it's all right. Let's go find the girls. End of The Old Fellow's Letter. Recording by Vince D.
Story 21 of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Janet Karam. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Story 21, The Parting of the Ways. Mrs. Longworth crossed the hotel piazza, descended the steps and walked out of sight, down the shore road with all the grace of motion that lent distinction to her slightest movement. Her eyes were very bright, and an unusual flush stained the pallor of her cheek. Two men who were lounging in one corner of the hotel piazza looked admiringly at her. "She is a beautiful woman," said one. "Wasn't there some talk about Mrs. Longworth and Cunningham last winter?" asked the other. "Yes, they were much together. Still, there may have been nothing wrong. She was old Judge Carmody's daughter, you know. Longworth got Carmody under his thumb in money matters and put the screws on. They say he made Carmody's daughter the price of the old man's redemption. The girl herself was a mere child. I shall never forget her face on her wedding day. But she's been plucky since then, I must say. If she has suffered, she hasn't shown it. I don't suppose Longworth ever ill-treats her. He isn't that sort. He's simply a groveling cad, that's all. Nobody would sympathize much with the poor devil if his wife did run off with Cunningham. Meanwhile, Beatrice Longworth walked quickly down the shore road, her white skirt brushing over the crisp golden grasses by the way. In a sunny hollow among the sandhills she came upon Stephen Gordon, sprawled out luxuriously in the warm, sea-smelling grasses. The youth sprang to his feet at the sight of her, and his big brown eyes kindled to a glow. Mrs. Longworth smiled at him. They had been great friends all summer. He was a lanky, overgrown lad of 15 or 16, odd and shy and dreamy, scarcely possessing a speaking acquaintance with others at the hotel. But he and Mrs. Longworth had been congenial from their first meeting. In many ways he was far older than his years, but there was a certain ineradicable boyishness about him to which her heart warmed. "You are the very person I was just going in search of. I've news to tell. Sit down." He spoke eagerly, patting the big gray boulder beside him with his slim brown hand. For a moment Beatrice hesitated. She wanted to be alone just then. But his clever, homely face was so appealing that she yielded and sat down. Stephen flung himself down again contentedly in the grasses at her feet, pillowing his chin in his palms and looking up at her adoringly. "You are so beautiful, dear lady. I love to look at you. Will you tilt that hat a little more over the left eyebrow? Yes, so. Some day I shall paint you." His tone and manner were all simplicity. "When you are a great artist," said Beatrice indulgently. He nodded. "Yes, I mean to be that. I've told you all my dreams, you know. Now for my news. I'm going away tomorrow. I had a telegram from Father today." He drew the message from his pocket and flourished it up at her. "I'm to join him in Europe at once. He is in Rome. Think of it, in Rome. I'm to go on with my art studies there, and I leave tomorrow." "I'm glad and I'm sorry, and you know which is which," said Beatrice, patting the shaggy brown head. "I shall miss you dreadfully, Stephen." "We have been splendid chums, haven't we?" he said eagerly. Suddenly his face changed. He crept nearer to her and bowed his head until his lips almost touched the hem of her dress. "I'm glad you came down today," he went on in a low, diffident voice. "I want to tell you something, and I can tell it better here. I couldn't go away without thanking you. I'll make a mess of it. I can never explain things. But you've been so much to me. You mean so much to me. You've made me believe in things I never believed in before. I know now that there is such a thing as a good woman, a woman who could make a man better just because he breathed the same air as her." He paused for a moment, then went on in a still lower tone. "It's hard when a fellow can't speak of his mother because he can't say anything good of her, isn't it? My mother wasn't a good woman. When I was 8 years old, she went away with a scoundrel. It broke my father's heart. Nobody thought I understood. I was such a little fellow. But I did. I heard them talking. I knew she had brought shame and disgrace on herself and us. And I had loved her so. Then, somehow, as I grew up, it was my misfortune that all the women I had to do with were mean and base. They were hirelings, and I hated and feared them. There was an aunt of mine. She tried to be good to me in her way. But she told me a lie, and I never cared for her after I found out. And then Father. We loved each other, and were good chums, but he didn't believe in much either. He was bitter, you know. He said all women were alike. I grew up with that notion. I didn't care much for anything. Nothing seemed worthwhile. Then I came here and I met you." He paused again. Beatrice had listened with a gray look on her face. It would have startled him had he glanced up, but he did not, and after a moment's silence the halting boyish voice went on. You have changed everything for me. I was nothing but a clod before. You are not the mother of my body, but you are of my soul. It was born of you. I shall always love and reverence you for it. You will always be my ideal. If I ever do anything worthwhile, it will be because of you. In everything I shall ever attempt, I shall try to do it as if you were to pass judgment upon it. You will be a lifelong inspiration to me. Oh, I am bungling this. I can't tell you what I feel. You are so pure, so good, so noble. I shall reverence all women for your sake henceforth. And if, said Beatrice in a very low voice, if I were false to your ideal of me, if I were to do anything that would destroy your faith in me, something weak or wicked. But you couldn't, he interrupted, flinging up his head and looking at her with his great dog-like eyes. You couldn't. But if I could, she persisted gently, and if I did, what then? I should hate you, he said passionately. You would be worse than a murderess. You would kill every good impulse and belief in me. I would never trust anything or anybody again. But there, he added, his voice once more growing tender, you will never fail me. I feel sure of that. Thank you, said Beatrice, almost in a whisper. Thank you, she repeated after a moment. She stood up and held out her hand. I think I must go now. Good-bye, dear laddie. Write to me from Rome. I shall always be glad to hear from you, wherever you are. And I shall always try to live up to your ideal of me, Stephen. He sprang to his feet and took her hand, lifting it to his lips with boyish reverence. I know that, he said slowly. Good-bye, my sweet lady. When Mrs. Longworth found herself in her room again, she unlocked her desk and took out a letter. It was addressed to Mr. Maurice Cunningham. She slowly tore it twice across, laid the fragments on a tray, and touched them with a lighted match. As they blazed up, one line came out in writhing redness across the page. I will go away with you as you ask. Then it crumbled into gray ashes. She drew a long breath and hid her face in her hands. End of The Parting of the Ways. Recording by Janet Karam.
Story 22 of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Agnew. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. Story 22. The Promissory Note. Ernest Duncan swung himself off the platform of David White's store and walked whistling up the street. Life seemed good to Ernest just then. Mr. White had given him a rise in salary that day and had told him that he was satisfied with him. Mr. White was not easy to please in the matter of clerks, and it had been with fear and trembling that Ernest had gone into his store 6 months before. He had thought himself fortunate to secure such a chance. His father had died the preceding year, leaving nothing in the way of worldly goods except the house he had lived in. For several years before his death he had been unable to do much work, and the finances of the little family had dwindled steadily. After his father's death, Ernest, who had been going to school and expecting to go to college, found that he must go to work at once instead to support himself and his mother. If George Duncan had not left much of worldly wealth behind him, he at least bequeathed to his son the interest of a fine, upright character and a reputation for honesty and integrity. None knew this better than David White, and it was on this account that he took Ernest as his clerk, over the heads of several other applicants who seemed to have a stronger pull. "I don't know anything about you, Ernest," he said bluntly. "You're only 16, and you have not an ounce of real grit or worth in you. But it will be a queer thing if your father's son hasn't. I knew him all his life. A better man never lived, nor, before his accident, a smarter one. I'll give his son a chance anyhow. If you take after your dad, you'll get on all right." Ernest had not been in the store very long before Mr. White concluded, with a gratified chuckle, that he did take after his father. He was hard-working, conscientious, and obliging. Customers of all sorts, from the rough fishermen who came up from the harbour to the old Irish women from the back-country roads, liked him. Mr. White was satisfied. He was beginning to grow old. This lad had the makings of a good partner in him by and by. No hurry. He must serve his long apprenticeship first and prove his mettle. No use spoiling him by hinting at future partnerships before need was. That will all come in due time. David White was a shrewd man. Ernest was unconscious of his employer's plans regarding him, but he knew that he stood well with him, and much to his surprise he found that he liked the work, and was beginning to take a personal interest and pleasure in the store. Hence he went home to tea on this particular afternoon with a buoyant step and smiling eyes. It was a good world, and he was glad to be alive in it, glad to have work to do and a dear little mother to work for. Most of the folks who met him smiled in friendly fashion at the bright-eyed, frank-faced lad. Only old Jacob Patterson scowled grimly as he passed him, emitting merely a surly grunt in response to Ernest's greeting. But then old Jacob Patterson was noted as much for his surliness as for his miserliness. Nobody had ever heard him speak pleasantly to anyone. Therefore his unfriendliness did not at all dash Ernest's high spirits. "I'm sorry for him," the lad thought. "He has no interest in life saving accumulating money. He has no other pleasure or affection or ambition. When he dies, I don't suppose a single regret will follow him. Father died a poor man, but what love and respect went with him to his grave, aye, and beyond it. Jacob Patterson, I'm sorry for you. You have chosen the poorer part, and you are a poor man in spite of your thousands." Ernest and his mother lived up on a hill at the end of a straggling village street. The house was small, old-fashioned one, painted white, set in the middle of a small but beautiful lawn. George Duncan, during the last rather helpless years of his life, had devoted himself to the cultivation of flowers, shrubs, and trees, and, as a result, his lawn was the prettiest in Conway. Ernest worked hard in his spare moments to keep it looking as well as in his father's lifetime, for he loved his little home dearly, and was proud of its beauty. He ran gaily into the sitting-room. "Tea ready, Lady Mother? I'm hungry as a wolf. Good news gives one an appetite. Mr. White has raised my salary a couple of dollars per week. We must celebrate the event somehow this evening. What do you say to a sail on the river and an ice cream at Taylor's afterwards? When a little woman can't outlive her schoolgirl hankering for ice cream, why, Mother, that's the matter. Mother dear." Mrs. Duncan had been standing before the window with her back to the room when Ernest entered. When she turned, he saw that she had been crying. "Oh, Ernest," she said brokenly, "Jacob Patterson has just been here, and he says... "What has that old miser been saying to trouble you?" demanded Ernest angrily, taking her hands in his. "He says he holds your father's promissory note for $900, overdue for several years," answered Mrs. Duncan. "Yes, and he showed me the note, Ernest." "Father's promissory note for $900!" exclaimed Ernest in bewilderment. "But father paid that note to James Patterson 5 years ago. Mother, just before his accident. Didn't you tell me he did?" "Yes, he did," said Mrs. Duncan, "but—" "Then where is it?" interrupted Ernest. Father would have kept the receipted note, of course. We must look among his papers." "You won't find it there, Ernest. We don't know where the note is. It must be lost." "Lost? That is unfortunate. But you say that Jacob Patterson showed you a promissory note of Father's still in existence? How can that be? It can't possibly be the note he paid, and there couldn't have been another note that we know nothing of." "I understand how this note came to be in Jacob Patterson's possession," said Mrs. Duncan more firmly, "but he laughed in my face when I told him. I must tell you the whole story, Ernest, but sit down and get your tea first." "I haven't any appetite for tea now, Mother," said Ernest soberly. "Let me hear the whole truth about the matter." "7 years ago your father gave his note to old James Patterson, Jacob's brother," said Mrs. Duncan. "It was for $900. 2 years afterwards the note fell due, and he paid James Patterson the full amount with interest. I remember the day well. I have only too good reason to. I went up to the Patterson place in the afternoon with the money. It was a very hot day. James Patterson receipted the note and gave it to your father. Your father always remembered that much. He was also sure that he had a note with him when he left the house. He then went over to see Paul St. Clair. A thunderstorm came up while he was on the road. Then, as you know, Ernest, just as he turned in at Paul St. Clair's gate, the lightning flash struck and stunned him. It was weeks before he came to himself at all. He never did come completely to himself again. When, weeks afterwards, I thought of the note and asked him about it. We could not find it, and search as we did, we never found it. Your father could never remember what he did with it when he left James Patterson's. Neither Mr. Sinclair nor his wife could recollect seeing anything of it at the time of the accident. James Patterson had left for California that very morning after, and never came back. We did not worry much about the loss of the note then. It did not seem of much moment, and your father was not in a condition to be troubled about the matter. But, Mother, this note that Jacob Patterson holds, I don't understand about this." "I'm coming to that. I remember distinctly that on the evening when your father came home after signing the note, he said that James Patterson drew up a note and he signed it. But just as he did so, the old man's pet cat, which was sitting on the table, upset an ink bottle, and the ink ran all over the table and stained one end of the note. Old James Patterson was the fussiest man who ever lived, and a stickler for neatness. 'Tut, tut,' he said, 'this won't do. Here, I'll draw up another note and tear this blotted one up.' He did so, and your father signed it. He always supposed James Patterson destroyed the first one, and certainly he must have intended to, for there never was an honester man. But he must have neglected to do so, for, Ernest, it was that blotted note Jacob Patterson showed me today. He said he found it among his brother's papers. I suppose it has been in the desk up to the Patterson place ever since James went to California. He died last winter, and Jacob is his sole heir. Ernest, that note with the compound interest on it for 7 years amounts to over $1,100. How can we pay it?" "I'm afraid this is a very serious business, Mother," said Ernest, rising and pacing the floor with agitated strides. "We shall have to pay the note if we cannot find the other, and even if we could, perhaps, your story of the drawing up of the second note would not be worth anything as evidence in a court of law, and we have nothing to hope from Jacob Patterson's clemency. No doubt he believes that he really holds Father's unpaid note. He is not a dishonest man. In fact, he rather prides himself on having made all his money honestly. He will exact every penny of the debt. The first thing to do is to have another thorough search for the lost note, although I'm afraid that it is a forlorn hope it proved to be. The note did not turn up. Old Jacob Patterson proved obdurate. He laughed to scorn the tale of the blotted note, and, indeed, Ernest sadly admitted to himself that it was not a story anybody would be in a hurry to believe. "There's nothing for it but to sell our house and pay the debt, Mother," he said at last. Ernest had grown old in the days that had followed Jacob Patterson's demand. His boyish face was pale and haggard. "Jacob Patterson will take the case into the law courts if we don't settle at once. Mr. White offered to lend me the money on a mortgage on the place, but I could never pay the interest out of my salary when we have nothing else to live on. I would only get further and further behind. I'm not afraid of hard work, but I dare not borrow money with so little prospect of ever being able to repay it. We must sell the place and rent that little 4-roomed cottage of Mr. Percy's down by the river to live in. Oh, Mother, it half kills me to think that you're being turned out of your home like this." It was a bitter thing for Mrs. Duncan also, but for Ernest's sake she concealed her feelings and affected cheerfulness. The house and lot were sold, Mr. White being the purchaser thereof, and Ernest and his mother removed to a little riverside cottage with such of their household belongings as had not also been sold to make up the required sum. Even then, Ernest had to borrow $200 from Mr. White, and he foresaw that the repayal of this sum would cost him much self-denial and privation. It would be necessary to cut their modest expenses down severely. For himself, Ernest did not mind, but it hurt him keenly that his mother should lack the little luxuries and comforts to which she had been accustomed. He saw, too, in spite of her efforts to hide it, that leaving her old home was a terrible blow to her. Although Ernest felt bitter and disheartened, his step lacked spring and his face its smile. He did his work with dogged faithfulness, but he no longer found pleasure in it. He knew that his mother secretly pined after her lost home where she had gone as a bride, and the knowledge rendered him very unhappy. Paul Sinclair, his father's friend and cousin, died that winter, leaving 2 small children. His wife had died the previous year. When his business affairs came to be settled, they were found to be sadly involved. There were debts on all sides, and it was soon only too evident that nothing was left for the little boys. They were homeless and penniless. "What will become of them, poor little fellows?" said Mrs. Duncan pityingly. "We are their only relatives, Ernest. We must give them a home at least." "Mother, how can we?" exclaimed Ernest. "We are so poor. It's as much as we can do to get along now, and there is that $200 to pay to Mr. White. I'm sorry for Danny and Frank, but I don't see how we can possibly do anything for them." Mrs. Duncan sighed. "I know it isn't right to ask you to add to your burden," she said wistfully. "It is of you I'm thinking, Mother," said Ernest tenderly. "I can't have your burden added to. You deny yourself too much and work too hard now. What would it be if you took the care of those children upon yourself?" "Don't think of me, Ernest," said Mrs. Duncan eagerly. "I wouldn't mind. I'd be glad to do anything I could for them, poor little souls. Their father was your father's best friend, and I feel as if it were our duty to do all we can for them. They're such little fellows. Who knows how they would be treated if they were taken by strangers? And they'd most likely be separated, and that would be a shame. But I leave it to you to decide, Ernest. It is your right, for the heaviest part will fall on you." Ernest did not decide at once. For a week he thought the matter over, weighing pros and cons carefully. To take the 2 Sinclair boys meant a double portion of toil and self-denial. Had he enough to bear now? But on the other side, was it not his duty, nay, his privilege, to help the children if he could? In the end he said to his mother, "We'll take the little fellows, Mother. I'll do the best I can for them. We'll manage a corner and crust for them." So Danny and Frank Sinclair came to the little cottage. Frank was 8 and Danny 6, and they were small and lively and mischievous. They worshipped Mrs. Duncan, and thought Ernest the finest fellow in the world. When his birthday came round in March, the two little chaps put their heads together in grave consultation as to what they could give him. "You know, he gave us presents on our birthdays," said Frank, "so we must give him something." "I'll give him my pocket-knife," said Danny, taking the somewhat battered and loose-jointed affair from his pocket and gazing at it affectionately. "Give him one of Papa's books," said Frank, "that pretty one with the red covers and the gold letters." A few of Mr. Sinclair's books had been saved for the boys, and were stored in a little box in their room. The book Frank referred to was An Old History of the Turks, and its gay cover was probably the best of it, since its contents were of no particular merit. On Ernest's birthday both boys gave him their offerings after breakfast. "Pocket-knife?" "Here's a pocket-knife for you," said Danny graciously. "It's a bully pocket-knife. It'll cut real well if you hold it just the right way. I'll show you." "And here's a book for you," said Frank. "It's a real pretty book, and I guess it's pretty interesting reading, too. It's all about the Turks." Ernest accepted both gifts gravely, and after the children had gone out, he and his mother had a hearty laugh. "The dear, kind-hearted little lads," said Mrs. Duncan. "It must have been a real sacrifice on Danny's part to give you his beloved pocket-knife. I was afraid you were going to refuse it at the first, and that would have hurt his little feelings terribly." "I don't think the history of the Turks will keep you burning the midnight oil. I remember that book of old. I could never forget that gorgeous cover. Mr. Sinclair lent it to your father once, and he said it was an absolute trash." "Why, Ernest, what's the matter?" Ernest had been turning the book's leaves over carelessly. Suddenly he sprang to his feet with an exclamation, his face turning white as marble. "Mother!" he gasped, holding out a yellowed slip of paper. "Look! It's the lost promissory note." Mother and son looked at each other for a moment. Then Mrs. Duncan began to laugh and cry together. "Your father took the book with him when he went to pay the note," she said. "He intended to return it to Mr. Sinclair. I remember seeing the gleam of the red binding in his hand as he went out of the gate. He must have slipped the note into it, and supposed the book has never been opened since. Oh, Ernest, do you think, will Jacob Patterson—" "I don't know, Mother. I must see Mr. White about this. Don't be too sanguine. This doesn't prove that the note Jacob Patterson found wasn't the genuine note also, you know. That is, I don't think it would serve as proof in law. We'll have to leave it to his sense of justice. If he refuses to refund the money, I'm afraid we can't compel him to do so." But Jacob Patterson did not any longer refuse belief to Mrs. Patterson's story of the blotted note. He was a harsh, miserly man, but he prided himself on his strict honesty. He had been fairly well acquainted with his brother's business transactions, and knew that George Duncan had given him only one promissory note. "I'll admit, ma'am, since the receipted note has turned up, that your story about the blotted one must be true," he said surlily. "I'll pay your money back. Nobody can ever say Jacob Patterson cheated. I took what I believed to be my due. Since I'm convinced it wasn't, I'll hand every penny over. Though, mind you, you couldn't make me do it by law. It's my honesty, ma'am, it's my honesty." Since Jacob Patterson was so well satisfied with the fibre of his honesty, neither Mrs. Duncan nor Ernest was disposed to quarrel with it. Mr. White readily agreed to sell the old Duncan place back to them, and by spring they were settled again in their beloved little home. Danny and Frank were with them, of course. "We can't be too good to them, Mother," said Ernest. "We really owe all our happiness to them." "Yes, but Ernest, if you had not consented to take the homeless little lads in their time of need, this wouldn't have come about." "I've been well rewarded, Mother," said Ernest quietly. "But even if nothing of the sort had happened, I would be glad that I did the best I could for Frank and Annie. I'm ashamed to think that I was unwilling to do it at first. If it hadn't been for what you said, I wouldn't have. So it is to your unselfishness we have to thank for it all, Mother dear." End of The Promissory Note. Recording by Mary Agnew.
Story 23 of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Story 23, The Revolt of Mary Isabel. "For a woman of 40, Mary Isabel, you have the least sense of any person I have ever known," said Louisa Irving. Louisa had said something similar in spirit to Mary Isabel almost every day of her life. Mary Isabel had never resented it, even when it hurt her bitterly. Everybody in Latimer knew that Louisa Irving ruled her meek little sister with a rod of iron, and wondered why Mary Isabel never rebelled. Well, it simply never occurred to Mary Isabel to do so. All her life she had given in to Louisa, and the thought of refusing obedience to her sister's Mede and Persian decrees never crossed her mind. Mary Isabel had only one secret from Louisa, and she lived in daily dread that Louisa would discover it. It was a very harmless little secret, but Mary Isabel felt rightly sure that Louisa would not tolerate it for a moment. They were sitting together in the dim living room of their quaint old cottage down by the shore. The window was open, and a sea breeze blew in, stirring the prim white curtains fitfully, and ruffling the little rings of dark hair on Mary Isabel's forehead, rings which always annoyed Louisa. She thought Mary Isabel ought to brush them straight back, and Mary Isabel did so faithfully a dozen times a day, and in 10 minutes they crept down again, kinking defiance to Louisa, who might make Mary Isabel submit to her in all things, but had no power over naturally curly hair. Louisa had never had any trouble with her own hair. It was straight and sleek and mouse-colored, what there was of it. Mary Isabel's face was flushed, and her wood-brown eyes looked grieved and pleading. Mary Isabel was still pretty, and vanity is the last thing to desert a properly constructed woman. "I can't wear a bonnet yet, Louisa," she protested. "Bonnets have gone out for everybody except really old ladies. I want a hat, one of those pretty floppy ones with pale blue forget-me-nots." Then it was that Louisa made the remark quoted above. "I wore a bonnet before I was 40, she went on ruthlessly, "and so should every decent woman. It's absurd to be thinking so much of dress at your age, Mary Isabel. I don't know what sort of a way you'd be dizzing yourself out if I'd let you, I'm sure. It's fortunate you have somebody to keep you from making a fool of yourself. I'm going to town to-morrow and pick you out a suitable black bonnet. You'd look nice starring around in Leghorn and forget-me-nots, now wouldn't you?" Mary Isabel privately thought she would, but she gave in, of course, although she did hate bitterly that unbought, unescapable bonnet. "Well, do as you think best, Louisa," she said with a sigh, "but I suppose it doesn't matter much. Nobody cares how I look anyhow. But can't I go to town with you? I want to pick out my new silk." "I'm as good a judge of black silk as you," said Louisa shortly. "It isn't safe to leave the house alone." "But I don't want a black silk," cried Mary Isabel. "I've worn black so long. Both my silk dresses have been black. I want a pretty silver gray, something like Mrs. Chester Ford's." "Did anyone ever hear such nonsense?" Louisa wanted to know in genuine amazement. "Silver gray silk is the most unserviceable thing in the world. There's nothing like black for wear and real elegance. No, no, Mary Isabel, don't be foolish. You must let me choose for you. You know you never had any judgment. Mother told you so often enough. Now get your sunbonnet and take a walk to the shore. You look tired. I'll get tea." Louisa's tone was kind, though firm. She was really good to Mary Isabel, as long as Mary Isabel gave her her own way peaceably. But if she had known Mary Isabel's secret, she would never have permitted those walks to the shore. Mary Isabel sighed again, yielded, and went out. Across a green field from the Irving cottage, Dr. Donald Hamilton's big house was hooding itself in the shadows of the thick fir grove that enabled the doctor to have a garden. There was no shelter at the cottage, so the Irving girls never tried to have a garden. Soon after Dr. Hamilton had come there to live, he had sent a bouquet of early daffodils over by his housekeeper. Louisa had taken them gingerly in her extreme finger-tips, carried them across the field to the lawn fence, and cast them over under the amused gray eyes of portly Dr. Hamilton, who was looking out of his office window. Then Louisa had come back to the porch door and ostentatiously washed her hands. "I guess that will settle Donald Hamilton," she told the secretly sorry Mary Isabel triumphantly. And it did settle him, at least as far as any further social advances were concerned. Dr. Hamilton was an excellent physician and an equally excellent man. Louisa Irving could not have picked a flaw in his history or character. Indeed, against Dr. Hamilton himself she had no grudge. But he was the brother of a man she hated, and whose relatives were consequently taboo in Louisa's eyes. Not that the brother was a bad man either. He had simply taken the opposite side to the Irvings in a notable church feud of a dozen years ago, and Louisa had never since held any intercourse with him or his fellow sinners. Mary Isabel did not look at the Hamilton house. She kept her head resolutely turned away as she went down the shore lane with its wild, sweet loneliness of salt-withered grasses and piping sea winds. Only when she turned the corner of the fir-wood, which shut her out from view of the houses, did she look timidly over the line fence. Dr. Hamilton was standing there, where the fence ran out to the sandy shingle, smoking his little black pipe, which he took out and put away when Mary Isabel came around the firs. Men did things like that instinctively in Mary Isabel's company. There was something so delicately virginal about her, in spite of her 40 years, that they gave her the reverence they would have paid to a very young, pure girl. Dr. Hamilton smiled at the little troubled face under the big sunbonnet. Mary Isabel had to wear a sunbonnet. She would never have done it from choice. "What's the matter?" asked the doctor, in his big, breezy, old bachelor voice. He had another voice for sick beds and rooms of bereavement, but this one suited best with the purring of the waves and winds. "How do you know that anything is the matter?" Mary Isabel parried demurely. "By your face. Come now, tell me what it is." "It is really nothing. I've just been foolish, that is all. I wanted a hat with forget-me-nots and a great silk, and Louisa says I must have black and a bonnet." The doctor looked indignant, but held his peace. He and Mary Isabel had tacitly agreed never to discuss Louisa, because such discussion would not make for harmony. Mary Isabel's conscience would not let the doctor say anything uncomplimentary of Louisa, and the doctor's conscience would not let him say anything complimentary. So they left her out of the question, and talked about the sea, and the boats, and poetry, and flowers, and similar non-combustible subjects. These clandestine meetings had been going on for 2 months, ever since the day they had just happened to meet below the firs. It never occurred to Mary Isabel that the doctor meant anything but friendship, and if it had occurred to the doctor, he did not think there would be much use in saying so. Mary Isabel was too hopelessly under Louisa's thumb. She might keep tryst below the firs occasionally, so long as Louisa didn't know. but to no farther lengths would she dare go. Besides, the doctor wasn't quite sure that he really wanted anything more. Mary Isabel was a sweet little woman, but Dr. Hamilton had been a bachelor so long that it would be very difficult for him to get out of the habit. So difficult that it was hardly worth trying while such an obstacle as Louisa Irving's tyranny loomed in the way. So he never tried to make love to Mary Isabel, though he probably would have if he had thought it of any use. This does not sound very romantic, of course, but when a man is 50, romance, while it may be present in the fruit, is assuredly absent in blossom. "I suppose you won't be going to the induction of my nephew Thursday week?" said the doctor in the course of the conversation. "No, Louisa will not permit it. I had hoped," said Mary Isabel, with a sigh, as she braided some silvery shore grasses nervously together, "that when old Mr. Moody went away, she would go back to the church here. And I think she would if Jim hadn't come in Mr. Moody's place," finished the doctor with his jolly laugh. Mary Isabel colored prettily. "It is not because he's your nephew, doctor. It's because he's the nephew of my brother, who was on the other side in that ancient church fracas. Bless you, I understand. What a good hater your sister is! Such a tenacity in holding bitterness from one generation to another commands admiration of a certain sort. As for Jim, he's a nice little chap, and he's coming to live with me until the manse is repaired." "I am sure you'll find that pleasant," said Mary Isabel primly. She wondered if the young minister's advent would make any difference in regard to these shore meetings, and then decided quickly that it would not, and then more quickly still that it wouldn't matter if it did. "He will be company," admitted the doctor, who liked company, and found the shore road rather lonesome. "I had a letter from him to-day saying that he'd come home with me from the induction. And by the way, they're tearing down the old post office to-day. And that reminds me, by Jove, I'd all but forgotten. I promised to go up and see Molly Marr this evening. Molly's nerves are on the rampage again. I must rush." With a wave of his hand, the doctor hurried off. Mary Isabel lingered for some time longer, leaning against the fence, looking dreamily out to sea. The doctor was a very pleasant companion, if only Louisa would allow neighborliness. Mary Isabel felt a faint, impotent resentment. She had never had anything other girls had, friends, dresses, beaux, and it was all Louisa's fault. Louisa, who was going to make her wear a bonnet for the rest of her life. The more Mary Isabel thought of that bonnet, the more she hated it. That evening Warren Marr rode down to the shore cottage on horseback and handed Mary Isabel a letter, a strange, scrumpled, soiled, yellow letter. When Mary Isabel saw the handwriting on the envelope, she trembled and turned as deadly pale as if she had seen a ghost. "Here's a letter for you," said Warren, grinning. "It's been a long time on the way, nigh 15 years. Guess the news will be rather stale. We found it behind the old partition when we tore it down to-day." "It's my brother Tom's writing," said Mary Isabel faintly. She went into the room trembling, holding the letter tightly in her clasped hands. Louisa had gone up to the village on an errand. Mary Isabel almost wished she were home. She hardly felt equal to the task of opening Tom's letter alone. Tom had been dead for 10 years, and this letter gave her an uncanny sensation as of a message from the spirit land. 15 years ago Thomas Irving had gone to California, and 5 years later he had died there. Mary Isabel, who had idolized her brother, almost grieved herself to death at the time. Finally she opened the letter with ice-cold fingers. It had been written soon after Tom reached California. The first 2 pages were filled with descriptions of the country and his job. On the third, Tom began abruptly, "Look here, Mary Isabel, you're not to let Louisa boss you about, as she was doing when I was at home. I was going to speak to you about it before I came away, but I forgot. Lou is a fine girl, but she's too domineering, and the more you give in to her, the worse it makes her. You're far too easygoing for your own welfare, Mary Isabel, And for your own sake, I wish you had more spunk. Don't let Louisa live your life for you. Just you live it yourself. Never mind if there's some friction at first. Lou will give in when she finds she has to, and you'll both be the better for it. I want you to be real happy, Mary Isabel, but you won't be if you don't assert your independence. Giving in the way you do is bad for both you and Louisa. It will make her a tyrant, and you a poor spirited creature of no account in the world. Just brace up and stand firm." When she had read the letter through, Mary Isabel took it to her own room and locked it in her bureau drawer. And then she sat by her window, looking out into a sea sunset, and thought it over. Coming in the strange way it had, the letter seemed a message from the dead, and Mary Isabel had a superstitious conviction that she must obey it. She had always had a great respect for Tom's opinion. He was right. Oh, she felt that he was right. What a pity she had not received the letter long ago, before the shackles of habit had become so firmly riveted. But it was not too late yet. She would rebel at last, and how had Tom phrased it? Oh, yes, assert her independence. She owed it to Tom. It had been his wish, and he was dead, and she would do her best to fulfill it. "I shan't get a bonnet," thought Mary Isabel determinedly. "Tom wouldn't have liked me in a bonnet. From this out, I'm going to do exactly as Tom would have liked me to do, no matter how afraid I am of Louisa. And oh, I am horribly afraid of her." Mary Isabel was every whit as much afraid the next morning after breakfast, but she did not look it by reason of the flush on her cheeks and the glint in her brown eyes. She had put Tom's letter in the bosom of her dress, and she pressed her fingertips on it that the crackle might give her courage. "Louisa," she said firmly, "I'm going to town with you." "Nonsense," said Louisa shortly. "You may call it nonsense if you like, but I am going," said Mary Isabel unquailingly. "I've made up my mind on that point, Louisa, and nothing you can say will alter it." Louisa looked amazed. Never before had Mary Isabel set her decrees at naught. "Are you crazy, Mary Isabel?" she demanded. "No, I'm not crazy, but I am going to town, and I am going to get a silver gray silk for myself and a new hat. I will not wear a bonnet, and you need never mention it to me again, Louisa." "If you're going to town, I shall stay home," said Louisa, in a cold, ominous tone that almost made Mary Isabel quake. If it had not been for that reassuring crackle of Tom's letter, I fear Mary Isabel would have given in. "This house can't be left alone. If you go, I'll stay." Louisa honestly thought that would bring the rebel to terms. Mary Isabel had never gone to town alone in her life. Louisa did not believe she would dare to go. But Mary Isabel did not quail. Defiance was not so hard, after all, once you had begun. Mary Isabel went to town, and she went alone. She spent the whole delightful day in the shops, unhampered by Louisa's scorn and criticism in her examination of all the pretty things displayed. She selected a hat she felt sure Tom would like, a pretty crumpled gray straw with forget-me-nots and ribbons. Then she bought a gray silk of a lovely silvery shade. When she got back home, she unwrapped her packages and showed her purchases to Louisa. But Louisa neither looked at them nor spoke to Mary Isabel. Mary Isabel tossed her head and went to her own room. Her draught of freedom had stimulated her, and she did not mind Louisa's attitude half as much as she would have expected. She read Tom's letter over again to fortify herself, and then she dressed her hair in a fashion she had seen that day in town, and pulled out all the little curls on her forehead. The next day she took the silver gray silk to the Latimer dressmaker and picked out a fashionable design for it. When the silk dress came home, Louisa, who had thought out somewhat in the meantime, unbent sufficiently to remark that it fitted very well. "I'm going to wear it to the induction to-morrow," Mary Isabel said. boldly to all appearances, quaking in reality. She knew that she was throwing down the gauntlet for good and all. If she could assert and maintain her independence in this matter, Louisa's power would be broken forever. 12 years before this, the previously mentioned schism had broken out in the Latimer Church. The minister had sided with the faction which Louisa Irving opposed. She had promptly ceased going to his church and withdrew all financial support. She paid to the Marwood Church, 15 miles away, and occasionally she hired a team and drove over there to service. But she never entered the Latimer Church again, nor allowed Mary Isabel to do so. For that matter, Mary Isabel did not wish to go. She had resented the minister's attitude almost as bitterly as Louisa. But when Mr. Moody accepted a call elsewhere, Mary Isabel hoped that she and Louisa might return to their own church home. Possibly they might have done so had not the congregation called the young, newly fledged James Anderson. Mary Isabel would not have cared for this, but Louisa sternly said that neither she nor any of hers should ever darken the doors of a church where the nephew of Martin Hamilton preached. Mary Isabel had regretfully acquiesced at the time, but now she had made up her mind to go to church, and she meant to begin with the induction service. Louisa stared at her sister incredulously. "Have you taken complete leave of your senses, Mary Isabel?" "No, I've just come to them," retorted Mary Isabel recklessly, gripping a chair back desperately, so that Louisa should not see how she was trembling. "It's all foolishness to keep away from church just because of an old grudge. I'm tired of staying home Sundays or driving 15 miles to Marwood to hear poor old Mr. Grattan. Everybody says Mr. Anderson is a splendid young man and an excellent preacher, and I'm going to attend his services regularly." Louisa had taken Mary Isabel's first defiance in icy disdain. Now she lost her temper and raged. The storm of angry words beat on Mary Isabel like hail, but she fronted it staunchly. She seemed to hear Tom's voice saying, "Live your own life, Mary Isabel. Don't let Louisa live it for you," and she meant to obey him. "If you go to that man's induction, I'll never forgive you," Louisa concluded. Mary Isabel said nothing. She just primmed up her lips very determinedly, picked up the silk dress, and carried it to her room. The next day was fine and warm. Louisa said not one word all the morning. She worked fiercely and slammed things around noisily. After dinner, Mary Isabel went to her room and came down presently, fine and dainty in her gray silk, with the forget-me-not hat resting on the soft, loose waves of her hair. Louisa was blacking the kitchen stove. She shot one angry glance at Mary Isabel, and then gave a short, contemptuous laugh, the laugh of an angry woman who finds herself robbed of all weapons except ridicule. Mary Isabel flushed, and walked with an unfaltering step out of the house and up the lane. She resented Louisa's laughter. She was sure there was nothing so very ridiculous about her appearance. Women far older than she, even in Latimer, wore light dresses and fashionable hats. Really, Louisa was very disagreeable. "I have put up with her ways too long," thought Mary Isabel, with a quick, unwanted rush of anger, "but I never shall again. No, never. Let her be as vexed and scornful as she pleases." The induction services were interesting, and Mary Isabel enjoyed them. Dr. Hamilton was sitting across from her, and once or twice she caught him looking at her admiringly. The doctor noticed the hat and the gray silk, and wondered how Mary Isabel had managed to get her own way concerning them. What a pretty woman she was! Really, he had never realized before how very pretty she was. But then he had never seen her except in a sunbonnet or with her hair combed primly back. But when the service was over, Mary Isabel was dismayed to see that the sky had clouded over and looked very much like rain. Everybody hurried home, and Mary Isabel tripped along the shore road, filled with anxious thoughts about her dress. That kind of silk always spotted, and her hat would be ruined if it got wet. How foolish she had been not to bring an umbrella. She reached her own doorstep panting just as the first drop of rain fell. "Thank goodness!" she breathed. Then she tried to open the door. It would not open. She could see Louisa sitting by the kitchen window, calmly reading. "Louisa, open the door, quick!" she called impatiently. Louisa never moved a muscle, although Mary Isabel knew she must have heard. "Louisa, do you hear what I say?" she cried, reaching over and tapping on the pane imperiously. "Open the door at once. It's going to rain. It's raining now. Be quick!" Louisa might as well have been a graven image for all the response she gave. Then did Mary Isabel realize her position. Louisa had locked her out purposely, knowing the rain was coming. Louisa had no intention of letting her in. She meant to keep her out until the dress and hat of her rebellion were spoiled. This was Louisa's revenge. Mary Isabel turned with a gasp. What should she do? The padlocked doors of hen house and well house and wood house revealed the thoroughness of Louisa's vindictive design. Where should she go? She would go somewhere. She would not have her lovely new dress and hat spoiled. She caught her ruffled skirts up in her hand, ran across the yard. She climbed the fence into the field and ran across that. Another drop of rain struck her cheek. She never glanced back, or she would have seen a horrified face peering from the cottage kitchen window. Louisa had never dreamed that Mary Isabel would seek refuge over at Dr. Hamilton's. Dr. Hamilton, who had driven home from church with the young minister, saw her coming and ran to open the door for her. Mary Isabel dashed up the veranda steps, breathless, crimson-cheeked, trembling with pent-up indignation and sense of outrage. "Louisa locked me out, Dr. Hamilton," she cried almost hysterically. "She locked me out on purpose to spoil my dress. I'll never forgive her. I'll never go back to her, never, never, unless she asks me to. I had to come here. I was not going to have my dress ruined to please Louisa." "Of course not, said Dr. Hamilton soothingly, drawing her into his big, cozy living room. "You did perfectly right to come here, and you're just in time. There is the rain now, in good earnest." Mary Isabel sank into a chair and looked at Dr. Hamilton with tears in her eyes. "Wasn't it an unkind, unsisterly thing to do?" she asked piteously. "Oh, I shall never feel the same towards Louisa again. Tom was right. I didn't tell you about Tom's letter, but I will by and by. I shall not go back to Louisa after her locking me out. When it stops raining, I'll go straight up to my cousin Ella's and stay with her until I arrange my plans. But one thing is certain, I shall not go back to Louisa." "I wouldn't," said the doctor recklessly. "Now don't cry, and don't worry. Take off your hat. You can go up to the spare room across the hall if you like. Jim has gone upstairs to lie down. He has a bad headache and says he doesn't want any tea. So I was going to get up a bachelor snack for myself. My housekeeper is away. She heard at church that her mother was ill and went over to Marwood." When Mary Isabel came back from the spare room, a little calmer but with traces of tears on her pink cheeks, the doctor had as good a tea-table spread as any woman could have had. Mary Isabel thought it was fortunate that the little errand boy Tommy Brewster was there, or she certainly would have been dreadfully embarrassed now that the flame of anger had blown out. But later on, when tea was over and she and the doctor were left alone, she did not feel embarrassed after all. Instead, she felt delightfully happy and at home. Dr. Hamilton put one so at ease. She told him all about Tom's letter and her subsequent revolt. Dr. Hamilton never once made the mistake of smiling. He listened and approved and sympathized. "So I'm determined I won't go back," concluded Mary Isabel, "unless she asks me to. And Louisa will never do that. Ella will be glad enough to have me for a while. She has 5 children and can't get any help." The doctor shrugged his shoulders. He thought of Mary Isabel as unofficial drudge to Ella Kimball and her family. Then he looked at the little silvery figure by the window. "I think I can suggest a better plan," he said gently and tenderly. "Suppose you stay here as my wife. I've always wanted to ask you that, but I feared it was no use, because I knew Louisa would oppose it, and I didn't think you would consent if she did not. I think," the doctor leaned forward and took Mary Isabel's fluttering hand in his, "I think we can be very happy here, dear." Mary Isabel flushed crimson, and her heart beat wildly. She knew now that she loved Dr. Hamilton, and Tom would have liked it. Yes, Tom would. She remembered how Tom hated the thought of his sisters being old maids. "I think so, too," she faltered shyly. Then said the doctor briskly, "What is the matter with our being married right here and now?" "Married? Yes, of course. Here we are in a state where no license is required, a minister in the house, and you all dressed up in the most beautiful wedding silk imaginable. You must see, if you just look at it calmly, how much better it will be than going up to Mrs. Kimball's, and thereby publishing your difference with Louisa to all the village. I'll give you 15 minutes to get used to the idea, and then I'll call Jim down." Mary Isabel put her hands to her face. You're like a whirlwind," she gasped. "You take away my breath." "Think it over," said the doctor in a businesslike voice. Mary Isabel thought very hard for a few moments. What would Tom have said? Was it probable that Tom would have approved of such marrying in haste? Mary Isabel came to the decision that he would have preferred it to having family jars bruited abroad. Moreover, Mary Isabel had never liked Ella Kimball very much. Going to her was only 1 degree better than going back to Louisa. At last Mary Isabel took her hands down from her face. "Well," said the doctor persuasively as she did so. "I will consent on one condition," said Mary Isabel firmly, "and that is that you will let me send word over to Louisa that I'm going to be married, and that she may come and see the ceremony if she will. Louisa has behaved very unkindly in this matter, but after all she is my sister, and she has been good to me in some ways, and I'm not going to give her a chance to say that I got married in this headlong fashion and never let her know." "Tommy can take the word over," said the doctor. Mary Isabel went to the doctor's desk and wrote a very brief note. "Dear Louisa, I am going to be married to Dr. Hamilton right away. I've seen him often at the shore this summer. I would like you to be present at the ceremony if you choose. Mary Isabel." Tommy ran across the field with a note. It had now ceased raining, and the clouds were breaking. Mary Isabel thought that was a good omen. She and the doctor watched Tommy from the window. They saw Louisa come to the door, take the note, and shut the door in Tommy's face. 10 minutes later she reappeared, habited in her mackintosh, with her second-best bonnet on. "She's coming," said Mary Isabel, trembling. The doctor put his arm protectingly about the little lady. Mary Isabel tossed her head. "Oh, I'm not. I'm only excited. I shall never be afraid of Louisa again." Louisa came grimly over the field, up the veranda steps, and into the room without knocking. "Mary Isabel," she said, glaring at her sister and ignoring the doctor entirely, "did you mean what you said in that letter?" "Yes, I did," said Mary Isabel firmly. "You're going to be married to that man in this shameless, indecent haste?" "Yes." "And nothing I can say will have the least effect on you?" "Not the slightest." "Then," said Louisa, more grimly than ever, "all I ask of you is to come home and be married from under your father's roof. Do you have that much respect for your parents' memory, at least?" "Of course I will," cried Mary Isabel impulsively, softening at once. "Of course we will, won't we?" she asked, turning prettily to the doctor. "Just as you say," he answered gallantly. Louisa snorted. "I'll go home and air the parlor," she said. It's lucky I baked that fruitcake Monday. You can come when you're ready." She stalked home across the field. In a few minutes the doctor and Mary Isabel followed, and behind them came the young minister, carrying his blue book under his arm and trying hard, and not altogether successfully, to look grave. End of The Revolt of Mary Isabel.
Story 24 of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by The Story Girl. Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Story 24, The Twins and a Wedding. Sometimes Johnny and I wonder what would really have happened if we had never started for Cousin Pamelia's wedding. I think that Ted would have come back sometime, but Johnny says he doesn't believe he ever would, and Johnny ought to know because Johnny's a boy. Anyhow, he couldn't have come back for 4 years. However, we did start for the wedding, and so things came out all right, and Ted said we were a pair of twin special providences. Johnny and I fully expected to go to Cousin Pamelia's wedding because we had always been such chums with her, and she did write to Mother to be sure and bring us, but Father and Mother didn't want to be bothered with us. That is the plain truth of the matter. They are good parents, as parents go in this world. I don't think we could have picked out much better, all things considered, but Johnny and I have always known that they never want to take us with them anywhere if they can get out of it. Uncle Fred says that is no wonder, since we are a pair of holy terrors for getting into mischief and keeping everybody in hot water. But I think we are pretty good, considering all the temptations we have to be otherwise. And of course, twins have just twice as many as ordinary children. Anyway, Father and Mother said we would have to stay home with Hannah Jane. This decision came upon us, as Johnny says, like a bolt from the blue. At first we couldn't believe they were not joking. Why, we felt that we simply had to go to Pamelia's wedding. We had never been to a wedding in our lives, and we were just aching to see what it would be like. Besides, we had written a marriage ode to Pamelia, and we wanted to present it to her. Johnny was to recite it, and he had been practicing it out behind the carriage house for a week. I wrote the most of it. I can write poetry as slick as anything. Johnny helped me hunt out the rhymes. That is the hardest thing about writing poetry. It is so difficult to find rhymes. Johnny would find me a rhyme, and then I would write a line to suit it, and we got on swimmingly. When we realized that Father and Mother meant what they said, we were just too miserable to live. When I went to bed that night, I simply pulled the clothes over my face and howled quietly. I couldn't help it when I thought of Pamelia's white silk dress and tulle veil and flower girls and all the rest. Johnny said it was the wedding dinner he thought about. Boys are like that, you know. Father and Mother went away on the early morning train, telling us to be good twins and not bother Hannah Jane. It would have been more to the point if they had told Hannah Jane not to bother us. She worries more about our bringing up than Mother does. I was sitting on the front doorstep after they had gone, when Johnny came around the corner, looking so mysterious and determined that I knew he had thought of something splendid.
"Sue,"
said Johnny impressively,
"if you have any real sporting blood in you, now is the time to show it. If you've enough grit, we'll get to Pamelia's wedding after all."
"How?" I said, as soon as I was able to say anything.
"We'll just go. We'll take the 10 o'clock train. It will get to Marsden by 11:30, and that'll be in plenty of time. The wedding isn't until 12.
But we've never been on the train alone, and we've never been to Marsden at all, I gasped.
Oh, of course, if you're going to hatch up all sorts of difficulties, said Johnny scornfully. I thought you had more spunk.
Oh, I have, Johnny, I said eagerly. I'm all spunk, and I'll do anything you'll do. But won't Father and Mother be perfectly savage?
Of course, but we'll be there, and they can't send us home again, so we'll see the wedding. We'll be punished afterwards, all right, but we'll have had the fun, don't you see?
I saw. I went right upstairs to dress, trusting everything blindly to Johnny. I put on my best pale blue shirred silk hat and my blue organdy dress and my high-heeled slippers. Johnny whistled when he saw me, but he never said a word. There are times when Johnny is a duck. We slipped away when Hannah Jane was feeding the hens.
I'll buy the tickets,
explained Johnny.
I've got enough money left out of my last month's allowance because I didn't waste it all on candy as you did. You'll have to pay me back when you get your next month's jink, remember. I'll ask the conductor to tell us when we get to Marsden. Uncle Fred's house isn't far from the station, and we'll be sure to know it by all the cherry trees round it.
It sounded easy, and it was easy. We had a jolly ride, and finally the conductor came along and said,
Here's your jumping-off place, kiddies.
Johnny didn't like being called a kiddie, but I saw the conductor's eye resting admiringly on my blue silk hat, and I forgave him. Marsden was a pretty little village, and away up the road we saw Uncle Fred's place, for it was fairly smothered in cherry trees, all white with lovely bloom. We started for it as fast as we could go, for we knew we had no time to lose. It is perfectly dreadful trying to hurry when you have on high-heeled shoes, but I said nothing and just tore along, for I knew Johnny would have no sympathy for me. We finally reached the house and turned in at the open gate of the lawn. I thought everything looked very peaceful and quiet for a wedding to be under way, and I had a sickening idea that it was too late and it was all over.
Nonsense,
said Johnny, cross as a bear, because he was really afraid of it too.
I suppose everybody is inside the house. No, there are 2 people over there by that bench. Let us go and ask them if this is the right place, because if it isn't, we have no time to lose.
We ran across the lawn to the 2 people. One of them was a young lady, the very prettiest young lady I had ever seen. She was tall and stately, just like the heroine in a book, and she had lovely curly brown hair and big blue eyes and the most dazzling complexion. But she looked very cross and disdainful, and I knew the minute I saw her that she had been quarrelling with the young man. He was standing in front of her, and he was as handsome as a prince, but he looked angry too. Altogether, you never saw a crosser-looking couple. Just as we came up, we heard the young lady say, "What you ask is ridiculous and impossible, Ted. I can't get married at 2 days' notice, and I don't mean to be." And he said,
"Very well, Una. I'm sorry you think so. You would not think so if you really cared anything for me. It is just as well I have found out you don't. I'm going away in 2 days' time, and I shall not return in a hurry, Una."
"I do not care if you never return," she said. That was a fib, and well I knew it. But the young man didn't. Men are so stupid at times. He swung around on one foot without replying, and he would have gone in another second if he had not nearly fallen over Johnny and me.
"Please, sir,"
said Johnny, respectfully, but hurriedly.
"We're looking for Mr. Frederick Murray's place. Is this it?" "No," said the young man, a little gruffly. "This is Mrs. Franklin's place. Frederick Murray lives at Marsden, 10 miles away."
My heart gave a jump and then stopped beating. I know it did, although Johnny says it is impossible.
"Isn't this Marsden?"
cried Johnny, chokily.
"No, this is Harrowsdean,"
said the young man, a little more mildly. I couldn't help it. I was tired and warm and so disappointed. I sat right down on the rustic seat behind me and burst into tears. as the storybooks say. "Oh, don't cry, dearie," said the young lady, in a very different voice from the one she had used before. She sat down beside me and put her arms around me. "We'll take you over to Marsden if you've got off at the wrong station." "But it will be too late," I sobbed wildly. "The wedding is to be at 12, and it's nearly that now. And oh, Johnny, I do think you might try to comfort me." For Johnny had stuck his hands in his pockets and turned his back squarely on me. I thought it so unkind of him. I didn't know then that it was because he was afraid he was going to cry right there before everybody, and I felt deserted by all the world. "Tell me all about it," said the young lady. So I told her as well as I could all about the wedding and how wild we were to see it and why we were running away to it. "And now it's all no use," I wailed, "and we'll be punished when they find out just the same. I wouldn't mind being punished if we hadn't missed the wedding. We've never seen a wedding, and Pamela was to wear a white silk dress and have flower girls, and oh, my heart is just broken. I shall never get over this, never, if I live to be as old as Methuselah." "What can we do for them?" said the young lady, looking up at the young man and smiling a little. She seemed to have forgotten that they had just quarreled. "I can't bear to see children disappointed. I remember my own childhood too well."
"I really don't know what we can do," said the young man, smiling back. "Unless we get married right here and now, for their sakes. If it is a wedding they want to see and nothing else will do them, that is the only idea I can suggest."
"Nonsense," said the young lady. But she said it as if she would rather like to be persuaded it wasn't nonsense. I looked up at her. "Oh, if you have any notion of being married, I wish you would right off," I said eagerly. "Any wedding would do just as well as Pamela's. Please do." The young lady laughed. "One might just as well be married at 2 hours' notice as 2 days," she said.
"Una,"
said the young man, bending towards her,
"will you marry me, here and now? Don't send me away alone to the other side of the world, Una."
"What on earth would Auntie say?" said Una helplessly.
"Mrs. Franklin wouldn't object if you told her you were going to be married in a balloon."
"I don't see how we could arrange. Oh, Ted, it's absurd."
"'Tisn't. It's highly sensible. I'll go straight to town on my wheel for the license and ring, and I'll be back in an hour. You can be ready by that time."
For a moment Una hesitated. Then she said suddenly to me, "What is your name, dearie?" "Sue Murray," I said. "And this is my brother, Johnny. We're twins. We've been twins for 10 years." "Well, Sue, I'm going to let you decide for me. This gentleman here, whose name is Theodore Prentice, has to start for Japan in 2 days, and will have to remain there for 4 years. He received his orders only yesterday. He wants me to marry him and go with him. Now, I shall leave it to you to consent or refuse for me. Shall I marry him, or shall I not?" "Marry him, of course," said I promptly. Johnny says she knew I would say that when she left it to me. "Very well," said Una calmly. "Ted, you may go for the necessaries. Sue, you must be my bridesmaid, and Johnny shall be best man. Come, we'll go into the house and break the news to Auntie." I never felt so interested and excited in my life. It seemed too good to be true. Una and I went into the house, and there we found the sweetest, pinkest, plumpest old lady asleep in an easy-chair. Una wakened her and said, "Auntie, I'm going to be married to Mr. Prentice in an hour's time." That was a most wonderful old lady. All she said was, "Dear me." You'd have thought Una had simply told her she was going out for a walk. "Ted has gone for license and ring and minister," Una went on. "We shall be married out under the cherry trees, and I'll wear my new white organdy. We shall leave for Japan in 2 days. These children are Sue and Johnny Murray, who have come out to see a wedding. Any wedding. Ted and I are getting married just to please them." "Dear me," said the old lady again. "This is rather sudden. Still, if you must. Well, I'll go and see what there is in the house to eat." She toddled away, smiling, and Una turned to me. She was laughing, but there were tears in her eyes. "You blessed accidents," she said, with a little tremble in her voice. "If you hadn't happened just then, Ted would have gone away in a rage, and I might never have seen him again. Come now, Sue, and help me dress." Johnny stayed in the hall, and I went upstairs with Una. We had such an exciting time getting her dressed. She had the sweetest white organdy you ever saw, all frills and laces. I'm sure Pamelia's silk couldn't have been half so pretty. But she had no veil, and I felt rather disappointed about that. Then there was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Franklin came in, with her arms full of something all fine and misty, like a lacy cobweb. "I've brought you my wedding veil, dearie," she said. "I wore it 40 years ago. And God bless you, dearie. I can't stop a minute. The boy is killing the chickens, and Bridget is getting ready to broil them. Mrs. Jenner's son across the road has just gone down to the bakery for a wedding cake." With that she toddled off again. She was certainly a wonderful old lady. I just thought of Mother in her place. Well, Mother would simply have gone wild entirely. When Una was dressed, she looked as beautiful as a dream. The boy had finished killing the chickens, and Mrs. Franklin had sent him up with a basket of roses for us, and we had each the loveliest bouquet. Before long, Ted came back with the minister, and the next thing we knew, we were all standing out on the lawn under the cherry trees, and Una and Ted were being married. I was too happy to speak. I'd never thought of being a bridesmaid in my wildest dreams, and here I was one. How thankful I was that I had put on my blue organdy and my shirred hat. I wasn't a bit nervous, and I don't believe Una was either. Mrs. Franklin stood at one side with a smudge of flour on her nose, and she had forgotten to take off her apron. Bridget and the boy watched us from the kitchen garden. It was all like a beautiful, bewildering dream. But the ceremony was horribly solemn. I'm sure I shall never have the courage to go through with anything of the sort, but Johnny says I will change my mind when I grow up. When it was all over, I nudged Johnny and said, "Ode," in a fierce whisper. Johnny immediately stepped out before Una and recited it. Pamelia's name was mentioned 3 times, and of course he should have put Una in place of it, but he forgot. You can't remember everything. "You dear funny darlings," said Una, kissing us both. Johnny didn't like that, but he said he didn't mind it in a bride. Then we had dinner, and I thought Mrs. Franklin more wonderful than ever. I couldn't have believed any woman could have got up such a spread at 2 hours' notice. Of course, some credit must be given to Bridget and the boy. Johnny and I were hungry enough by this time, and we enjoyed that repast to the full. We went home on the evening train. Ted and Una came to the station with us, and Una said she would write me when she got to Japan, and Ted said he would be obliged to us for ever and ever. When we got home, we found Hannah Jane and Father and Mother, who had arrived there an hour before us, simply distracted. They were so glad to see us safe and sound that they didn't even scold us, and when Father heard our story, he laughed until the tears came into his eyes.
"Some are born to luck, some achieve luck, and some have luck thrust upon them," he said.
End of The Twins and a Wedding. Recording by The Story Girl. End of Lucy Maud Montgomery Short Stories, 1907 to 1908, by Lucy Maud Montgomery.